All right, I think we're set. Hey guys, Anton the Tech Chap, and this is it, the brand new Mac Studio. And it's essentially a Mac Mini, but on steroids. It's not very often Apple introduces a whole new product range. And this kind of fills the gap between a Mac Mini, or maybe an iMac, and a Mac Pro desktop. And it is simply stunning. It really is. They've kind of reinvented what a desktop PC can be, or at least what it looks like. And while I know there's going to be a lot of eye rolling as tech reviewers drool over the new Apple products, I get it, I do. And while this does actually pose a bit of a dilemma, which I'll come back to in a second, right now, if you want the most powerful Mac you can buy, that also happens to be in a pretty compact box that neatly fits under your monitor, then this is it. Look at that clearance. It's almost as if they knew what they were doing over at Apple. This, I should say, is also the new Studio display, which is very nice, but I will be doing a separate review on that. But this video is all about the Mac Studio, and you too can have this shiny aluminium box on your desk for the cool sum of £2,000, which is actually the same in dollars. Although if you do want the M1 Ultra version of this, then, well, you can double that. And design-wise, it looks very much like two Mac Minis on top of each other, and it actually feels incredibly dense. There's also a genuinely impressive range of ports on this thing, including Thunderbolt 4, HDMI, Ethernet, headphone jack, even a couple of USB-A ports, and around the front we have two more USB-Cs, although on the M1 Ultra version they are also Thunderbolt, as well as a fast SD card reader, which I found incredibly useful actually, as I've edited this entire video on this Mac Studio. The M1 Max version of this weighs 2.7 kilograms, whereas the M1 Ultra, for some reason, actually weighs 3.6 kilograms. In fact, the extra couple of pounds, or 900 grams, is due to the M1 Ultra model having a larger copper thermal module versus the Max's aluminium heatsink. But surprisingly, whether you go for the Max or the Ultra, they're both rated at the same 370 watts, which is actually about half what you'd expect from a modern Windows desktop PC. I genuinely don't know the answer to this, but how can an M1 Ultra version of this have the same max power draw as an M1 Max version? I mean, the Ultra is essentially two Maxes super glued together. It's a bit more complicated than that, and we'll come to in a second. One theory I have is that perhaps they're underclocking the Ultra a little bit to save some headroom for the upcoming Mac Pro, which might come out later in the year. It's absolutely insane, the kind of performance we get from this in a form factor this size, while only drawing a maximum of under 400 watts. Even more incredible is the fact that over there on my desktop PC where I have an RTX 3090, that thing under load actually takes more power, or about the same amount, as this entire Mac Studio combined. And that's before the processor and all the extras and the SSD and the RAM and all that business. So this review model sent by Apple has the M1 Ultra, as well as 128 gigs of unified memory and 4 terabytes of storage. Quite a beefy spec, but let's talk about the M1 Ultra for a second, because, as I say, this is essentially two M1 Maxes on the same chip, and everything is doubled. Double the CPU and GPU cores, double the neural engine cores, also support for double the memory, and also the media engine in the Ultra has twice the power for encoding and giving you up to 18 8K ProRes video streams simultaneously if you want. So if you are thinking about buying one of these, there's a few big questions. Firstly, what's the difference between the Max and the Ultra, of which I cannot tell you because I currently do not have an M1 Max version of this, but I have bought one myself and it should be coming soon, so I'll be doing a separate versus video. The second question is, just how fast is this? Apple have some crazy claims about being up to 3.5 times faster than an iMac and twice as fast as a top spec Mac Pro in some situations, so I'm going to put this to the test. And thirdly, the big question, should you actually buy it? Well, to help answer that a little bit, while as I say I don't have the M1 Max Studio, I do have this. It is the MacBook Pro 16 with the M1 Max. And while it is not a like-for-like comparison because this has double the memory, 128 gigs versus 64, and also bear in mind that the Max version of this will probably be faster than the Max version of this because they don't have to, cram it into a laptop chassis with all those constraints and also have it run off a battery. But let's have a bit of fun with this, comparing the fastest MacBook Pro 16 you can buy to the fastest Mac Studio. And in Cinebench R23, we're looking at a 95% boost in multi-core. That's nearly twice as fast. Although, as you can see, single core is actually the same. So really the only CPU boost here comes down to having more cores. But then jumping into a bit of Blender, the dedicated CPU test of this renders 30% faster on the Mac Studio, whereas it's 83% faster in the GPU test, which is huge. But what about video editing? Well, your mileage may vary depending on whether you edit in Premiere, DaVinci, or Final Cut, but to test it, I ran the extended Puget Premiere Pro benchmark, which replicates a project with 4K and 8K footage. It tests how fast the timeline is, adding effects, rendering, all that good stuff. Now, these results are interesting because the Mac Studio overall is 36% faster. However, when you break it down, actually the effects and the GPU scores are 61 and 51% higher respectively. So really, it's these graphically demanding tasks that are seeing the biggest benefit with the Ultra. So this is that Puget test running now, and I actually ran this a few times on both because I had some weird results, particularly on the MacBook Pro 16. I actually found, for some reason, this was scoring roughly the same as this. Until I then broke it down, it was actually the live playback score, which seemed to be much higher on this, and therefore, across the average, boosted the performance, which I couldn't really understand. What was this live playback? Why is this faster than that? Well, it's the screen. This is a 120Hz Pro Motion screen, whereas this Studio Display is still, sadly, 60Hz. So to remove that variable, I switched this down to 60Hz, and then we had the results I showed you a second ago, which make a lot more sense. But it kind of raised an interesting point that, yes, playback is faster when you have a smoother 120Hz refresh rate. And so, while, again, this is for a separate review video, as nice as this is, there are benefits to actually editing and working on a Mac screen or on a high refresh external monitor. Anyway, I digress. Let's jump over to Adobe Lightroom, and in my test of exporting 500 raw photos taken on my Sony a7S III to JPEGs, it took the MacBook Pro 2 minutes and 10 seconds versus just 1 minute 4 on the Mac Studio, which is almost exactly half the time. Which, considering it's a CPU-intensive task, makes sense considering we have twice the number of cores. And finally, while Macs really aren't meant for gaming, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, maxed out at Full HD, we're looking at a slightly more modest but still impressive 35% boost. So to the surprise of absolutely no one, yes, the M1 Ultra in here is faster than the M1 Max in here. The true test will be a Max versus a Max, which, as I say, I don't have just yet. But it is interesting to see just how much of an upgrade we are seeing with that M1 Ultra, and also how well it's utilized. And remarkably, since most of this space inside is taken up by the cooling system and fans, it is actually incredibly quiet. During my test, I heard it maybe once during the end of one of my benchmarks, and that was barely audible, whereas the MacBook Pro 16, which itself is already very quiet, the fans did get louder at the same point in the test. So we have performance for days, and it stays cool and quiet. The thing is, everyone has different workflows, so it can be kind of hard to quantify what this performance actually means for you, but let me just show you what I'm doing right now. So this is what I'm looking at. I have my Premiere Pro edit, my project, and this is actually 4K 10-bit 422 H.264 footage, which doesn't play back nicely on anything really except a top-spec MacBook Pro or indeed this Mac Studio. I'm also blendering, as you can see here. I've got my little Ripple water going. At the same time, 9 more streams of that same 4K 10-bit video. Now you can see that is not playing back smoothly. I have apparently found the limit of what this machine can do, but if this was ProRes, it would be a totally different story. If we jump over to the activity monitor, you can see that we really are maxing out that RAM, 119 gigs of the 128 being used. So if you do want to pay more for RAM, it is certainly utilized. Let's do one more little test, and this is Octane X, and I've got some of the default projects here. So let's jump over to the hallway render target, and it is chugging away rendering nicely, as you can see. Let's see how long it takes. This is the Mac Studio. 11 seconds to fully render that frame. All right, so let's see how long this takes. 18 seconds versus 11. The Mac Studio wins. But let's back up for a second. How have Apple done this? Well, firstly, I think Apple's design and engineering teams need to meet up with their marketing teams, because we had the M1, then the M1 Pro, then the M1 Max, and now obviously we have the M1 Ultra, because Ultra is higher than Max. I don't know what comes next. Maybe the M1 Super Duper Deluxe Legendary Edition or something. I don't know. But all M1s are based on Apple's own silicon, which uses a 5nm architecture. And so the transition from Intel is almost complete. Only the 27-inch iMac and the Mac Pro still use the old tech. But then we thought, oh, well, we're going to see a new M2 chip, perhaps, to replace the MacBook Air and that iMac, the 27-inch, which is very old now and not worth buying. But no, instead we have the M1 Ultra, which is, as I say, essentially two Maxes in one. But crucially, thanks to the crazy high bandwidth, and also the fact that software and apps only see this as one chip, not two Maxes, there are no optimizations or app updates required to fully take advantage of it. Which is a massive deal, because as you guys know, if you're a PC gamer or you just have a desktop PC, there's been issues with, SLI graphics cards, and also in some cases those Intel Xeon workstations where you had two CPU chips in the same PC. There were so many issues and driver problems, and you did not get twice the performance. Sticking two GPUs in there, I don't even think the RTX 3000 series support SLI anymore, but in the past, if you whacked in another 2080 with your 2080, you might get 15, 20, 25% boost. It is a genuine technological revolution. Not only the M1 architecture, but the fact that they can combine them into one SoC, and there are no problems, and it scales almost perfectly. You may still have bottlenecks elsewhere, and not all apps are fully optimized to take advantage of this kind of performance, but across the board, whether you're rendering in Octane or Blender, editing in Premiere or Final Cut, and yes, even gaming, the Ultra in here is a significant step up, and right now it represents the best performance you can get on a Mac. But that is until we see a new Mac Pro desktop, which I suspect we will see at WWDC, not that far away, and I would be a bit concerned about dropping between £2,000 and £8,000 on this if you need that kind of performance for your workflow. And then in just a couple of months, a Mac Pro desktop comes out, which no doubt will be more powerful because of the, thermal headroom, and it's not constrained to this tiny little box. And also it's gonna be a lot more flexible and upgradable. Yes, more expensive, but if you're buying this for the performance and you're not that bothered about it being a small rectangular box you can fit in a backpack, then it might be worth waiting for the Mac Pro. Having said that, part of the charm of the Mac Studio is this size. You can take it home into the office, you can drop it on someone else's desk and just plug it in. You can put it in a backpack. Although I think Apple maybe needs to offer a little square sling bag for this, or travel case, although they'd probably charge $500 for it. So let's talk about money, because I think the entry level, the base model of this is actually not bad value. For $2,000, you get an M1 Max with 512 storage and 32 gigs of unified memory, which is a lot of money, but a similarly spec'd MacBook Pro 14, for example, would set you back $2,800. Although, of course, with that, you do get a nice screen, keyboard, touchpad, it's a laptop. But if you need M1 Max level of performance, I think that base model is ideal, although maybe up the storage to 1TB, as nothing in here is upgradable. You can add an extra 8 GPU cores for £200 if you like, but the jump up to the M1 Ultra is not just this whopping £1,400 it says here, but it also insists that you have 64 gigs of memory and 1TB of storage. So the minimum an M1 Ultra Mac Studio will cost is $4,000. One thing I actually didn't realize until I've been using this for a while is that it has built-in speakers. I've obviously been using this Studio Display most of the time, but you can see if I go to the sound settings, we have the Mac Studio speakers, which come out the back. They're terrible, but they're useful for just basic use, or for when you're first setting it up, or if you haven't got anything else. Ideally, you'd want to use a proper setup. The lower right of the camera module with the like this display. Holding your phone like this, there's a bit more room for your index finger without it going over the camera module. So should you buy it? Well, no. 99% of people, no. That is what the Mac Mini is for, with the M1 chip, which is still very capable, and for about £700. That is for most people. But then, as it says on the tin, this is the Mac Studio. It is meant for professionals, designers, renderers. Most professionals and businesses will be paying for this on their company credit card and then having the tax write-off as it's a business asset. But on the flip side, as I say, I am a bit worried about how this will compare with the Mac Pro. I think it might be worth waiting and seeing. Don't forget though that you are literally just buying this box, which also comes with a power cable, nothing else. So you will need a monitor, it doesn't have to be this one, but maybe this one, and of course, keyboards and trackpads. Apple actually sent over their new black and silver keyboard, which is the Touch ID model, and also the very nice matte black Surface touchpad, and of course the Magic Mouse, which still has that ridiculous underneath lightning charger. No actual design changes, just a fancy new color. So let's wrap up, and we have a lovely design, all the ports you'd need, incredible performance, especially with the Ultra, but even the Max is beyond pretty much everything else out there. It also uses significantly less power than an equivalent Windows desktop with a high-end GPU, plus it stays cool and quiet. And actually, I don't think the base model is terrible value for money. Downsides? Well, it can get very expensive, especially with the Ultra. There's also no upgradability at all. Still, I've got to say, I am blown away by this. Coming from the old Intel and AMD powered Macs of the past with their jet engine fans and overheating and throttling issues, where it always made sense to go for a Windows desktop PC where you can obviously upgrade it and buy the components yourself. These days, with the component shortages, how expensive GPUs are, and also just the optimizations of the software, the hardware, their own architecture, all in this form factor. It's just a kind of beautiful harmony, and I would recommend it if you are on the lookout for a, well, studio high-performance compact Mac. But what do you reckon? Would you be tempted to buy one of these or not? Let me know what you make of it in the comments below. And if you did enjoy this video, a like and a subscribe would be very much appreciated. And stay tuned for my full review of this and also my upcoming comparisons between this and the Max version, and also this and my desktop gaming PC. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time right here on the Tech Chat.